Hey, everybody. We are live here at the Microsoft MTC in Malvern, Pennsylvania for the Dev Talk Show. You've got me, Chris Gomez, and we have Rich Ross behind the camera and behind the microphone. And so we're here tonight on October 9th, Wednesday, October 9th, approximately 8:30 or so U.S. Eastern Time, getting a little bit closer to daylight savings ending, and then it'll be darker even sooner relative to when we get up. I'm going to get a whole bunch of people who, if they watch this, would say, like, that doesn't change anything. All I do. So
yeah, that screen never changes back there.
Yeah, well, right. Well, I mean, you know, it's dark, but certainly, and it seems to happen a lot among developers, I think. And I think it might be because we're all so tired of dealing with time and time zones that I've even heard developers say things like, we should just all use UTC and then adjust.
Right. Convert for your own local time, right?
Just figure out I have to go to work at 4 a.m., right? It doesn't matter what time it is in your time zone. But here we are, and hope you're having a good week. We are getting ready for Philly.net Code Camp next week, a local event that both Rich and I are presenting at. I have a talk on Git called Curing Your Fear of Git in about an hour, and that'll kind of be, I'm actually redoing it from beginning to end. I've done Git talks in a while, and for quite a while, but I started over. I didn't really throw them out because there was a lot of work in there, but new slide deck and everything, and part of it was because I decided that I felt like there were too many blank stares after the talk. I really
blank
did.
Stares from
just people who I think I overwhelmed, maybe.
Git can be that way if you're not
right.
I mean, if you get anything past just add, commit, and push, right?
Right. And so what I decided was, and I'm giving this a try, is to say, I'm going to be a little more practical about this, more about workplace scenarios that I feel like I've seen and helped people through.
Okay.
And we'll see how that goes. And also, this is what's taking a lot of time, is very slide heavy, which is not like me. I'm usually very demo oriented.
Right.
But I got this idea in my head that maybe part of the problem is that demos are great, but if I type some commands and explain them, even if I explain them, if that's the best explanation you've ever heard in your life, and we run it through and it all works great, you get up and leave the room and go to other sessions, and then you go home and what did Chris say again?
Right.
So a lot more screenshots, a lot more of here's the command line, here's what I did, here's the results. Now, the problem with that is that you can fly through screens.
Yeah.
You know? So, I mean, I don't think I've ever had this many slides before, and I've got a lot more that I want to do. But the way I look at it is if I make the slideshow available, it could serve as like recap documentation. So even if you don't remember exactly what I said, that's fine. You might remember the basics, and then you go look at the slide, and maybe I'm hoping that'll be what helps people have the confidence when they go back to work and say, why does it say that I want to accept my merge again?
Right. You know? And you're pretty good about putting the slides somewhere where they're local or accessible. Yeah.
I think in this case, I'll probably just have them on the Philly.net site or even on my own GitHub. What I have, neglected is my own blog, and that's something I've got to get back to, because I used to be pretty good about saying, hey, I would even have a blog post up before the talk. So that actually, we might as well just go into what we thought about talking tonight. Is we said, okay, so both Rich and I are working hard on presentations, and they take a lot of work. Sometimes it might be 10 to 1 in terms of hours. Sometimes it might be 4 to 1. And, I'll be honest, I think one of the reasons I might gravitate towards demo heavy talks is because once I've built the demo, I'm kind of done, and I rely on my ability to explain the rest of it.
Right.
So we thought we would talk about that. We might tease out some tips for presenters, including first-time presenters or even seasoned presenters, by talking about what we're going to do. So this isn't a presentation. We don't have slides or even bullet points, but I think that you might consider this a little behind the scenes as to what I do, and then maybe Rich, what you do.
Yep.
And anybody in chat, we know we have Andy couldn't be here with us tonight, and we have him here. So say hi to Andy, and also hi to our friend Bruno, who's a great friend of the show. So I think maybe we'll tease out a little bit of what goes into the thought process. And I will tell you that for me, I think part of why I gravitated towards the demo heavy approach is that, and it's not because I'm trying to waste time, but it takes time. And then questions naturally tease themselves out from the audience. That takes time. And then if I do a good job of explaining what I did, then maybe I don't really need as many slides. And I'll try to wrap it up with the very documentation that I used so that you could, go back and maybe hopefully you've seen what I've done and now you're willing to look at the same thing and you've got your kickstart. That's a very different thing from the talk that maybe is either a little more abstract or says, I'm going to load up on tons of slides and maybe even research and showing you lots of charts and graphs. I imagine that increases the length of time you spend building the presentation immensely.
Yeah. Everybody kind of approaches it a little bit differently, right? And what's interesting about the talk you're doing and the talk I'm doing, they're in and of themselves are a little bit different, right? You're going to do a little bit, you're not going to, so you're going to, let me make sure.
We can level set it, right? So it's cure your fear of Git in about an hour. And so what that means is I'm trying to say you're the developer who you have to use Git at work, and it generally works okay, but every once in a while you get into that place where you can't figure out what to do next, and so you take your code changes and you save them off to the desktop or somewhere, and you delete your repository, you clone it again from your whatever your server is, and then you put your changes back in, and maybe you push those up and everything's fine, and maybe that still doesn't work, and now you're really scratching your head as to why is this so hard. So I'm trying to take that practical approach. It's not about the idea is not to say you should learn the ins and outs of Git. However, to be fair, you do need to learn what I call them, these verbs mean.
Right.
I think it means something to commit. It means something to push, to fetch, to pull. And if we have time, although I don't know that I will, I'd like to take a look at how those verbs translate to popular tools. Because, I have my favorite, which a lot of people here know, but there are others that are very popular. So and I'm trying to do this, that this is something that I haven't done yet, but to finally say okay, so we've learned these verbs, we've learned these things you can do. How do you do this in Visual Studio? How do you do it in VS Code with the Git extensions? How do you do it in GitHub Desktop, Git Kraken, and so on? That might be ambitious. That might be a talk by itself.
Sure.
So it may get cut.
And it may be one of those. Part of the nice things about we get to do is if you interact with the audience that way, you may find some of the stuff you thought you were going to have to go into, they kind of get, or they want to go into a direction that you've got other content to talk to, right?
Yeah,
and you can always bring that forward.
Yeah, so there's a technique too. Andy is saying that he starts with slides and building an outline, and I will tell you, and I think we can get to that in a little bit. I do want to come back to that, Andy, about how you build them.
Yeah, because I don't do it that way.
Yeah, and again, it'll be a case of do as I say, not as I do when we get to that. But
you have to. I don't know. I always think of you've got to. Even though yes, I want slides at the end of it, you have to go with how you feel best in your creative process.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I don't think in slides. Slides are what I know I need to eventually come out into.
Right.
So that's
right. But you mentioned something just a few seconds ago, which I think was a good point. You had kind of said to me that if you go ahead and build the content and it turns out that some of the stuff you thought you needed to focus on you didn't, you can be like an accordion and say, well, that's okay. Hey, if this group's ahead, then let's do some extra value. And I think that's something that maybe I don't always do. And so there's a little bit of just sort of knock on wood. Mm-hmm. Hopefully we don't have 20 minutes left and I'm staring at the audience, which has never happened to me, by the way. And I don't know if that's happened to anyone. That's never happened to me.
It always seems to run out of time.
I do.
75 minutes is never enough time for whatever talk you have.
Part of it, I think, is sometimes I think I need to talk less. Like I just need to say one sentence and then move on.
Okay.
It's too easy for me to tell a story, and I know that. So I do try to work on that.
But I think stories are good. Sometimes we don't tell enough of the story side of it. We just try and be technical and,
sure.
You have a presentation style that is conducive to that storytelling manner, and I think that's important. Not everybody does, and it's a rare trait to have. And stories is how you connect with people. So I think that all goes into being important that way. So.
Yeah, so like Andy says, he's been to a lot of talks where the presenter finishes 20 minutes early. I think it was Andy, because they have nothing left. And yeah, that happens. Yeah. And I think
I think I end up having that sometimes with finish earlier than I expect because I talk fast and I just kind of get into it. And that's something I've been trying to work on is how do you slow that down and get that pacing going the right way so you don't run through everything.
And that's a good point. Even here on the show, I have to keep reminding myself to slow down and enunciate. It almost can even, like, I'm going to do it now because I said it. It can even make you feel like you might be a little unnatural. But the reality is, it is so easy to talk so fast that you just run right over the audience. And what is difficult to work on is to avoid some of the things that are easy to do, the uhs, the ahs, the ands. I once worked with someone, he was in sales, and he had said, if you can, just stop. Don't use the filler word. Your brain's catching up. Everyone knows it, but you will actually command the room. Silence is commanding, is what he said. Now, sales.
Sure.
But maybe not wrong.
No, I think as a presenter, you're afraid of silence, and that silence period, is double or triple the time it is compared to the audience. But it's if you can get that bit of patience and wait that beat, and embrace the silence, if you will. I think you're right. You do get that command of the room because everybody's like, okay, he stopped talking, even if they weren't paying attention. They recognize the pause, and that brings them back into, okay, what he's going to say next is got to be pretty important because there's a long pause here.
Right, or it takes you back to grade school where the long pause from the teacher meant that you should really look up because you were supposed to be paying attention.
Because somebody's getting the eye stare from the teacher, right?
Yeah. I appreciate what Andy said about how it stinks if you finish early, and I understand that the audience's time is valuable, whether they're paying for it or not. I want to do a good job for them. But I think, especially at free events like Code Camp, we have to be careful to not shame people into thinking that they shouldn't try again.
Yeah.
And look, I think after Code Camps became a regular, common thing, I would hear a comment in the hall about like, well, that person wasn't very good, or I wish I didn't go see that. And, I get it. It was still your time, but it was also free. And I think we need these kind of events to nurture the next generation, or heck, my generation. Please, get out there and present on something you're working on, because you'll help somebody.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have a couple things that, so I do want to get back to what Andy said about starting with slides and building an outline, which I think building an outline is a brilliant, fantastic idea that I am terrible at. And the reason is that I get stuck on step one, the opening.
Yeah.
So, and I've had a lot of difficulty coping with that, where sometimes the best part of my presentation is the first 10 minutes because it's the part that I probably went over in my head 400 times.
Mm-hmm.
And then as it went on, it's almost like that horrible story about the painter who left the paint can at the front of where they're painting and was painting the line, and then they kept walking back. Well, that's how I'm thinking in my head about the presentation, so I keep going over this part again and again. That could be, I don't know exactly for sure what it is. I certainly haven't been diagnosed with anything, but sometimes it feels a lot like an ADHD type symptom. Again, haven't ever seen a doctor or been diagnosed. And so, but when I watched a presentation by someone with ADHD talking about how they cope, their strategy was just open the PowerPoint or the notebook, and it doesn't matter what order, just start writing.
Yep.
And then now that it's all out there, then you can start rearranging. And I've been trying to do that lately.
Yeah.
And I've had more success.
Yeah. And I totally agree with that process. If you're trying to think about that, looking at the blank page and getting started is always the worst part, right?
For me, it's really bad. And it maybe isn't for everyone. It might just be something I just don't know. I don't want to put myself in anyone else's shoes.
Yeah.
But
so far we're at 100%. Chat room, feel free to chime in as well. But I think there's some nugget or something that made me want to give this talk. Whether it's some certain feature, some certain app or demo or something, and that's kind of where I start with. Like, okay, if I'm going to talk about that, well, now what do I need to build around it? You start building a little above, a little below, and just starting to put content on the page that you can then rearrange. And that's why, while an outline is awesome and important, I don't do it in PowerPoint. I'll use OneNote because it is just totally freeform text that I can indent, bullet, rearrange as I need to, throw in links to references that I want to make sure I talk about, throw in maybe even bits of content from those references that support what it is I'm trying to talk about. So that OneNote page for me becomes that initial structure of what I want that talk to feel like. And I do the same thing. I play it over in my head once I, at least in the order I'm in, and try and say, does this feel right? Does this feel, am I missing a step, or am I having too much, believing that the audience understands too much and I'm just jumping into this.
Yep.
So all of those things kind of go into where I come from.
Yeah, that's another fight, right? Is deciding where you think the audience is.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to guess, without any data whatsoever to back it up, that the more you do this, the more you probably assume the audience is advanced. It can be really easy to forget the level 100, the intro tutorials, because you start to think like, well, what's so exciting about that? They could have just watched a YouTube video or read the quick start on Microsoft Docs.
Yeah.
But it turns out there are a lot of people out there that even if they have read those, they still want to be with you because they might know you after you've done this a few times, and have somebody walk through it that hopefully what they're hoping for is that you've got some expertise and they can ask maybe not the hard questions, but at least something.
Yeah.
Maybe they struggled with it. Or what I like to do is when I am building a presentation and I get stuck, and I might lose 2 to 3 hours of my time on something, then I know when I solve it that I'm putting it in the presentation.
Sure.
Because I will flat out tell people, I lost a day on this.
Right.
So I don't want you to, you know, and then I feel like,
I mean, why you...
Like then sometimes that's worth the price of admission. People have even told me like, well, that tip was better than everything else, right? Absolutely. Because you warned me away from something that got you. So like for example, I've done Git presentations a few times. So on my screen I've got a lot of these things sitting in OneDrive. Mm-hmm. And,
do you want me to, sorry.
Yeah. Let me see if I'm just picking one up now. So
where are you? You're on 5. Try that.
Okay. So because I've given this talk a few times, I can say that I have actually sometimes gone through, and so I'm going through and I'm saying, okay, and I'll rearrange. I'll say, you know what? I think I'm going to take this section and move it. I'm going to do it earlier. I'm going to do it later. So I have picked a lot of these things up and moved them, where maybe in the past I might have had this first, because I think I wanted to open up with some levity. So in the practical Git talk, I like to show this. I like to show this comic, a pretty famous comic from XKCD. Oh, thank you. And it says, this is Git. It tracks collaborative workflow through a beautiful distributed graph theory tree model. And then the person says, cool, how do we use it? It says, no idea, just memorize these commands, type them to sync up. If you get errors, save your work elsewhere, delete the project, download a fresh copy, which is exactly the point of the talk, right?
Nice.
So I always show that. And then what happened is that I used to have this at the front of the talk, but I moved it to the end, because what I found was, when I did this talk, by the time I got through an opening and talked a little bit about Linus's talk, where he explains his reasoning, why did he do it? This is a pretty famous tech talk, at least, famous for Git nerds like me, that he gave in 2007 at Google, where he talked about why did he do it, the history. And so I summarized like some of his goals, but then what happened is I realized that by the time I got through this and talked about the fun man page generator, it was already half an hour in. And I went, oh man, I have to do much better than that, because I've taken a ton of time. This was a joke, by the way. If anybody's ever seen Git documentation, which they used to get made fun of. It used to be very, the verbs in Git, sometimes when you look at the man pages, which is Linux-based documentation, you'd be like, I don't even understand what I'm looking at. So this person made what they called the Git man page generator. It's still here, and example, it says not real Git documentation, but Git pilot remote. Pilot the unstaged remotes over various fsect projects. Now, you might think this is actually Git documentation, right? It's using Linuxy language and Git language and whatever, and I mean, this is generated. So something that I think is funny, if I go to actual Git help documentation, you'll see why that's funny. I know it's very nerdy. So this is real. Not that this is hard to understand, but as you can see, as with all Git commands, there's 4,000 options and 5,000 different ways to do things. So therefore, this might as well be Git documentation too, right? So
that just goes to show that we're not all great at documentation.
Yeah, right.
So while you're doing that, one of the questions that is in the chat, and it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on this. Bruno writes, he's wordy when he gives his presentation, so having that trouble to be concise when he gives, and are there certain things that we can kind of do from an exercise perspective to handle that?
So I will say that I get on tangents all the time, like I just did. And I sometimes regret having maybe given up valuable time for that. I don't know necessarily the audience regrets it. I think, again, if you're a good storyteller or you have something useful to say, it's fine. But probably one of the things that I've tried to do is, let's take a look at this slide. This slide used to be longer. Thanks, I didn't even mention it. This slide used to be longer. For some reason, I thought that when you start a presentation, you have to introduce yourself, and then you have to validate your reason for being in front of everyone.
Right.
Not only do I think that's not necessarily true, I actually have taken this slide completely out recently in many cases to just try saying, hey, I'm Chris Gomez. Here's how you can contact me. Let's go.
Okay.
And it's not, I don't want to be too cynical about it. I don't want to say, well, nobody cares, because I don't think that's true.
No.
I think it's just that it is so easy to be 15 minutes in and realize that all you've really done is introduce yourself and maybe introduce why you're interested in this topic.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. So less words on the slide. I've seen some presenters, I'm going to name drop here. You're going to have to look at the presentations yourself, but Douglas Crockford tends to put, his slide is like 4 words in huge, bold letters.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he can talk, but boy, is his information dense. So if you watch one of his JavaScript history presentations, I actually think, and maybe this is something we'll have to look for, one of the best presentations I've ever seen in my entire life is, in my opinion, The Tale of JavaScript by Douglas Crockford. It's older now. It's from 2010. It was presented at Mix. But I think the reason why I would watch this and try to learn from it is specifically because the slides don't make you stop and read them, but they're certainly important. And then he just packs in the information with every slide.
Right.
And it's not even, I'm not even bringing this up because of the topic. I just think it's one of my favorite presentations that I've ever seen. He's talking to technical people, and I learned more in that hour than I may have learned like in a year. It was amazing.
So just, I guess, kind of level say. So packing in the information doesn't necessarily mean you're wordy.
No,
or vice versa.
That's right. So, I think there's something. I guess maybe there's knowing when to move on, or how try to have confidence that you've said something. I believe there's a rule about how you say something and then you repeat it.
Yeah.
But you repeat it a different way because you're trying to get to the different ways people learn.
Mm-hmm.
But it's okay to trust your audience and move on, but then stop and ask them if they're following.
Right. So I know I get into that wordy conversation when I don't think I've gotten the message across. So I try and do it a couple different ways. And there's this nervous, things like, all right, am I losing them?
No one's getting it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if that's, and I think you're right. I think the best way to kind of combat that is, maybe say it one way and then check and make sure if we're good. If not, you got that backup way to say it.
Yeah, I think, always avoid, if you can, and this is hard. This is so hard. Easy for me to say.
Mm-hmm.
Avoid reading your slides.
Yeah.
Super hard to do. So instead, if you can try to turn your slides into the theme of what you're about to say, then you don't have to read them.
Mm-hmm.
And there are mistakes even in that presentation that I just showed you. I think this slide is a mistake. I think that if I look back at this again, I probably should have just said suitable for open source collaboration and something that is not CVS or SVN, because that was a major topic of his. He went on a tirade about CVS.
Okay.
So it was important to him.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't have to repeat it. You can watch I've presented to you the video. You're free to watch it later. And I have to ask myself, do these bullet points contribute to what I want, which is, remember the title of the talk was Practical Git. And I actually think, no, they don't.
All right.
So I could have just said, look, here were Linus's goals. Now, why is that important? And maybe this is something that I got wrong. Maybe what I should have done is I should have thought more about the why was it important. The reason I wanted to bring up Linus's goals, and still do, is so that when you ask me why is it so complicated, the answer is because Linus Torvalds built a source control system specifically for Linus Torvalds and Linux.
Right.
He was solving his problems.
Sure.
So if those problems don't directly align with yours, you may find the solution complicated. And what I like to get across to the audience is That's okay. You are not a bad person because you think it's complicated.
Mm-hmm.
He's solving the problem of managing one of the largest open source projects in the world without having to give any permissions to any of the collaborators.
Yep.
Which wasn't a problem we solved before.
Yeah.
Like if you and I were using we could pick any source control system. We could pick TFS. We could pick Subversion. For you to contribute to my repo, we got to be in the project together.
Yep.
And that
absolutely.
doesn't fly. Yeah, for Linux, right?
No, definitely.
So that's what I should have done. I should have had just those 2 bullet points so that I get across that these were Linus's reasons. And then the next slide could have been, if you think this is complicated, that's okay. I could have said what I just said, and we could have moved on.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of me reading the bullet points, which I'm sure I did. I bet you I did, because it's so hard as a human being to just throw that up there and not want to summarize it.
Yeah.
Like even though I tell myself, and I've even gotten tips that you don't have to do it, you do it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe don't put the words up.
Yeah. And I'm a fan of slides that are less is more. Like enough that I could say, okay, I want to talk about that, and then I can talk about it, as opposed to having all of my, pretty much a large portion of what I want to talk about up there on the slides where everybody's reading them anyway. Which in certain cases I've run into, people want the slides to live on their own.
Yes.
And without having seen the presentation, and that's
Yeah, you bring up a great point. You really do, because we have, and we don't have to bring it up, we have sites like SlideShare.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a fantastic point, that there are plenty of folks out there who will say, hey, I did a talk today, here are the slides. And they've done such a fantastic job on the slides that you almost felt like you saw the presentation.
Sure. It's like their narrative, basically.
I wonder if that's trying too hard to serve 2 masters. And I don't want to criticize it, because I can think of people who are very talented at this. Our friend Shahid Chowdhury, who is a developer, I think a developer advocate. I'm going to get his role wrong, but I know he works for Microsoft. And he's in the DC area. I'm sorry if I got the title or exact department wrong, but he speaks to developers, and some of the most thorough presentations with amazing slides. We, I think, have 1 or 2 recorded over on the Philly.net channel. And so there's somebody who I know when he posts, hey, I did this talk and here's my slide share, that I feel like I sat in on it, even though I didn't get the awesome tidbits and the conversation and maybe the extra advice. But wow, that's a lot of work. And I really admire that, because that is a lot of work.
Definitely.
So we have some presentations next week. The Git one, I don't think we're really going to focus on, but Rich, you're doing a full day workshop on Azure DevOps.
Yeah, which goes to, while it's related to your talk on Git, it's a little bit of a different kind of talk in that it's all day. Yep. So there's a lot more content we're going to pull together, and a lot, potential content that, depending on how the audience is, we've got some flexibility to cater to what they're interested and coming out to see for the day.
Right.
I think the other thing that's different with what we have is that it's also hands-on. So there's a good bit of thinking about that content, of how you want to kind of tee that up, and then what are those labs going to be that they're going to run through. So.
Right. Yep. And so I believe the full running time is it 7 hours, or maybe 6 if you include lunch?
Yeah, it's 8:30 to 4, so it's and then lunch it's about 7.
Okay.
And then in my mind, I kind of divide it up into 90-minute blocks, just so you have some way to kind of block out the day, essentially.
Okay. So maybe there's a tip there. So first of all, different format from an hour presentation, which the hour can fly. Now, I have done a couple full days, and believe it, they flew too. Yeah. But you worry, or at least I do. In fact, I've been terrified of the idea that there's no way. It's going to be noon, and I'm going to be like, well, I don't know. I guess we're good.
Thanks, everybody. Good
Yeah,
night.
thanks for coming. Lunch will be served shortly. Well, maybe in a half an hour.
Right. Give and take. Depending on what schedule we're on.
Yeah. And then after that, I don't know if you want to come back and maybe we can, the Knicks lost last night. I don't know. So I was terrified of that, and it didn't happen. In fact, when I thought about it, I said, boy, I feel like I could have done more, because I think I may have filibustered a little bit, just fancy word for being wordy. I may have done that now and then. But anyway, so you had an interesting tip. Like, what if I took the day and break it into blocks, about 90 minutes?
Right.
Reasonable times to take quick breaks, too.
Yeah, because there's, I don't know, it always seems to me that 90-minute slot seems to be a good breaking point. I've absorbed a ton of information. I've gotten maybe a couple of topics under discussion to the point where it's time to, all right, let's move away and digest some of that and then come back and get refreshed, get up, stretch, all that good stuff.
Right.
There was me being wordy as well. Go ahead.
Let me I'm just going to get Notepad up. And so what we're going to do, without any promise that this is actually what the presentation is going to be, is talk a little bit about how, you're going to give a presentation on Azure DevOps.
Yep.
So I think we might tease out how someone might go about this, just by pretending that we're going to go about this.
Yeah.
And actually, we may end up using a lot of this.
Yeah. So quite possibly.
Yeah. So I have Azure DevOps open.
Okay.
And then what I'm also going to do is open just a little notepad here.
Yeah.
And you said 8:30. So I think if we switch over there, 8:30 to, am I still on there or am I on there? There we go.
Now we can see you. Okay.
So you said it was 8:30 to 4.
Yeah.
And you said, so earlier Rich said, and I think this is a good idea, is let's say you think that there's going to be 90-minute blocks, and then, boy, doesn't it sound perfect that you tell everybody, hey, take a break, people get up, get another cup of coffee, and then, and not that I've ever been this, in my life, I've never really been this oriented. And actually, though, I'm thinking that maybe this is the right way to go about it, because now my mind's already a little at ease that, like, oh, it's only 4 segments.
Yes. And I think that's the part of, whether it's a 7-hour session or what have you, or 70-minute talk, a 15-minute talk. What can you do, if you can break it down into the smaller chunks, just like we do with a coding problem, right?
Right.
We break it down into the smaller things that we can digest and basically solve. So.
Yep. Now, what the nice thing about this is, it's okay to be a little loose with this. I wonder if this, yeah, there we go, better. Because you figure 11:45, now that may not actually be when lunch is, so that's great, because it means that this could go to like 10:30. And if it does, whatever.
Yeah, it's a gauge. You get that flexibility.
So you figure you come out of lunch, like, what if you say this is noon? And if you were to come out of lunch 12:30, is that fair, maybe? You can go to 2, and then another quick little break, and then you can go from 2:15 to 4, and there you go.
Home run.
There's a day. Now, let's, again, doing Azure DevOps, which I have here on the left. One of the things I thought, let's see if all 5 of them are here. No, they're not really. So let's go with this. I'm sure there's a page that shows this breakdown.
Yeah. I know I have slides that do that, but yeah.
When you're in an Azure DevOps project, you have this overview, and then you have boards, repos, pipelines, test plans, artifacts. Perfect. There's 6 of these, and there's 4 of these, so that's almost perfect.
Yeah, and we were kind of chatting a little bit about this earlier on in trying to pull this together. There might be certain ones of these that we don't spend a ton of time on just because of what they are, right?
Right. So that's the next thing and we've discussed this a little bit, but some of this is meant to be, we actually held off on discussing some of it.
We didn't go into too much detail.
Let's let it flow.
Right.
So what are the priorities? And I want to stress that I came up with this, and I said, because Rich is in charge of it, but I kind of wanted to give him a little help by saying, I'm going to pretend that I'm thinking about coming to an Azure DevOps thing.
Right. Potential audience member.
What do I want to see?
Yeah.
And I said in my head, because I know a little bit about Azure DevOps, is that, well, the number one thing that's interesting to me is pipelines, because this is the continuous build. In fact, I might not even use the word continuous. This is the automated build and deployment stuff. So I'm thinking, wow, that I can't wait to come see how Azure DevOps helps me with that.
Right.
The next thing that I thought in my head a lot of people might ask about is, and this might be at odds with what I would have thought of if I made the presentation without doing this exercise, was boards. Because I do know that a lot of folks, when I've given 1 hour Azure DevOps presentations, I've skipped over boards.
How come?
Because I've never used it.
Okay.
and I was not a TFS user, not for any other reason than I just didn't happen to work in TFS workplaces, except for a very short amount of time.
Okay.
I was a heavy visual source safe user, but wow, we're going a long time back.
Oh yeah.
So people would say to me things like, hey, Azure boards, and we were really big fans of TFS, and we integrate it heavily we use it. How does that work with Azure DevOps? And I'm like, but it seems to be common. So clearly the thought process for me was, someone's going to say, this Azure board stuff, how easy is it to use in Visual Studio?
Right.
I feel like that's the tie-in, but which again, it's me, but
well, I think there's a tie-in to boards into Studio, but I think there's also a tie-in to boards in all of the things you're doing in the Azure DevOps part, because that's where your epics, your features, your stories, your tasks, your bugs, everything that you're going to do some kind of code change against, that's where all of that is going to reside and gets created, as well as organizing all of those things so that they land in the appropriate sprint or your specific iteration that you're working on. So having that structure in place is going to then, for people who are used to using those kind of kind of components in Azure DevOps, for them, they need that as their structure and how they do their work.
Okay. Yeah. No. And so you're right. There's the value of some audience members are TFS users, and then there's other audience members who just say, "Oh, this does the." I don't know if I want to use the word process, but I'm going to. This does the process side of sprints, epics, features, backlog.
Yep.
And those terms are in there.
Yeah. And if you're doing Agile or Scrum, those are the things that you're kind of used to, right? Assigning points to a story so you know how many stories you can do in a sprint. Right?
Yeah.
All of that process. And I think process is probably a good word for it, because it's meant to, everybody's in sync of what we're going to deliver over the course of that sprint. But compare and contrast what we're doing in DevOps with something like what you might do in GitHub, which doesn't really have anything like that. I still have potentially code that I'm writing against. You have the ability to do issues,
right? And
say your issue is bound, is related to this set of check-ins, or the set of issues is related to this check-in, or what have you.
Right. Yeah. I mean, features are coming to GitHub, but and they're going to be great. But we know they've announced the GitHub Actions, which feels a little pipelines-like.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then and for issues are awesome. But what's funny about issues is that really lends you to the open source model, right? Because anyone can raise them. It's funny. I think of that as slightly different from a story.
It is.
Story feels internal.
I agree with you. I think it is, and I think that to some extent goes to where they started from, of DevOps being more the internal, but can be public, and GitHub being more public, but it can be internal. I think there's that I want to say lineage, but it's probably another, the history of where it came from.
Right. And so then, for me, the priorities is, as I said, okay, so pipelines, boards, and then I said after that, to me, if I'm in the audience, I probably want to understand repos, but here's where I fully admit, am I too much in my own head? Because it's do I want to use this or stick with XYZ, internal or GitHub or whatever. And the great thing about that is that I think you can answer that question maybe without saying it out loud, because of the you can kind of introduce repos, say here's what they are, but when you're back in pipelines, you're showing that you can take source from a lot of different places, so that sort of answers the question, or at least it lets people understand that they have options.
Yeah.
And then in my head I said, okay, artifacts, what is this exactly, and test plans, what is this exactly? So this is where my brain was when I tried to pretend that I was typical audience member. So then do we then relate this back to the time slots?
I think we can. I think, and some of it, while there are, 5 pieces there and roughly 5 topics, there's going to be a little bit of, I think they're not all going to be weighted equally, I guess, what it comes down to.
Right.
So,
and that's kind of where I was too, is they're not all weighted equally. So, there was a good suggestion there that I'd like to see, understand how things connect in a real project. So does that mean that the dream scenario is, today we began with project X, and we're going to walk you through how you would use Azure DevOps to do all these things. Is that one way to go about doing this?
I think so, because you want to make it real world for people. So yeah. I think you're going to, when we say end to end, I see creating a board with a story, or a sprint with a story in it that I need to do some kind of work. I'll make some code changes, do the check-in process that gets us talking about repo. Then once that code is in there, that ability to build that project, have the build happen. If there are unit tests or things that might break the build, have the issue, kind of show what that looks like and how you can prevent that from having your build actually get checked back into the master on a pull request because your unit tests have failed, right? So those are things that you're doing to make sure that your code, your main branch of your master stays healthy, right?
Right.
And then ultimately, if it passed and it went back to the master, well, now we've got a trigger that can do the pipeline that can push it out to the environment. I think if I understand that end to end, I mean, that kind of a scenario makes sense. And seeing it going from that idea that we need to implement through all those various steps, and then doing it, not only explaining how that works, but then doing it hands-on.
Yeah. So the star of the show here for me is pipelines, because in the end, people want to see that I took some code on check-in or commit, whatever term you want to use, and I built it. And if that failed, okay, great.
Yeah.
Like there's good. Good in terms of you're showing the feature of the product.
Yep, absolutely.
Stop the process cold. And, that's interesting. I never really thought about that. So we say pipelines and, try to build. What if that fails, right? And so do you think there would be discussion of notifications?
Yeah.
Is that a thing? Okay.
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's a whole overarching piece of this in that we've kind of touched on it, but there are integrations across all of those things we've got there. And some of those integrations are because of where code might live in other systems like GitHub, or code might need to get pushed to when we think of not just Azure, but maybe on premises, maybe other cloud providers, that capability to basically build it and push it anywhere it needs to go. As well as when those things happen, how do we do notifications, and what applications do we integrate with to be able to see that information? So potentially something like Teams might be an endpoint to say the build got kicked off, it passed, the staging deployment, and then that would send something off into Teams that we could then collaborate around. If the build broke, also is probably a better use case around, hey, the build broke, what happened, and have the team all in there collaborating on what that means.
Yeah, that's interesting. Interesting just because it sounds like, again, the talk starts to write itself and say, so I'm using Azure pipelines, I try to build, it fails, what's next? And you just answered a lot of it. Like I said, in email, but you also said it could be Teams, and then there's other integrations. I don't know how many there are, but a popular idea might be, can it go, would the GitHub issue know? I don't know.
Or log an issue in GitHub, or log a bug in DevOps, or something like that, right?
What would happen over in boards, which is where tasks and defects live, right?
Exactly.
So, okay, so you try to build, and then, okay, now designing. Oh, you also said running unit tests. Okay, and now the great thing about that is this can fail too. So,
sure.
But we've already covered what you can do.
Yep.
But now designing pipelines becomes an interesting thing, because one of the things we did while we were talking about this is we said, okay, let's look at what it looks like to a user. And so we have an internal project here that builds the Dev Talk Show website. And here's one of those examples of where I would actually be kind of excited and say, awesome, I'm going to get to tell everybody to watch out for this. So when we built the Dev Talk Show website, you can see that Andy Schwam built it, and he has a couple commits here, and the builds worked. And if I want to see what composes this build pipeline, I come over to the edit button in the upper right, and here's a YAML file that describes how to build this. And so, I'm sitting here looking at this, and I digest it, and I say, okay, yeah, I get it. Not that my memory is a little hazy on how all this works. And I say, okay, yeah, .NET build, and that step's going to be called .NET build. That makes sense. And what's the task? And then we're going to publish it out to a location. And great, now we've got a build artifact if this all worked correctly. Right. So then I went back to builds, and I said, let me just refresh my memory on how the second build pipeline, which was intended for our .NET Core 3 branch at DNC-Azure Pipeline. So it's a different branch. And I clicked on edit, and I immediately did this double take, like, well, wait a second, it doesn't look any different. And that can't be right, because I remember that we were using preview .NET Core 3, so we have to install that somewhere. And I started going, I don't understand what happened to our build pipeline. And look, it's all 100% just me, right? User not paying attention. But that when I'm here in builds and I click that I want to edit, the word edit doesn't exactly mean what Chris Gomez, thinks it means to looking between the two pipelines. What it means is, since pipelines live in YAML files in branches,
right,
I need to switch to the branch that represents this YAML file, that represents the .NET Core 3 pipeline.
Yeah.
In my opinion, if I want to be, complaining, I can say, well, wait a second, this should have matched up with this. Okay, whatever, that's fine. That's not the point. The point is, I get to tell the audience now.
Yeah.
Once you do the multiple pipeline thing in the same project, because you're trying to do what we're doing, is I want to keep production going, but I want to start thinking about the future. Then here's a safety tip for you. Make sure you're looking at the YAML file on the branch before you go nuts and think, oh my gosh, it's gone, or do something crazy like go start editing things to make it come back. Everything's fine.
Yes.
So I think I'm pushing a little hard for like one of those safety tips that I talk about where I'm going to save you time. But it was something that I came up with tonight. So there it is. Maybe it'll help somebody. But more importantly, I look for these in presentations.
Right. Yeah, the chance to give a nice little lesson learned.
Yeah.
So you don't have to.
Right. I look for those, and that goes for anything I do. If I'm doing Blazor, when I did game development, if something tripped me up for an extended period of time, I don't necessarily assume that, well, it was just because I messed up. I mean, sure, that might be it, but someone else might make the same assumptions and the same mistakes. So if I can save them, 2 hours and 45 minutes of the 3 hours, then maybe they'll feel like, hey, that was a worthwhile talk to go to.
Yeah, definitely.
So
I think those are the experiences that you get by doing all the right prep, because even it doesn't matter how many times you run through some of those demos, you may not on the first demo try, maybe not the second, but that third one is like, oh, where did that come from?
Yeah.
You kind of get in this habit of, oh, I got this, and all of a sudden, boom, you get hit with this error that you hadn't seen before.
Right. And I think a lot of times some folks just collectively refer to that as the demo gods, right?
Of course.
Which can be many different things. It can be user error. It can be that you just, for whatever reason, you zigged left when you should have zigged right. And every other time that you ran through this, you did the other thing. Sometimes it can be that every other time I did this, I did it methodically, and this time I said, "Oh, come on, I'm sure it'll be fine," and I'll click, and then I have no idea what could have possibly happened.
Yeah.
Or what is starting to happen maybe a little bit more with platform as a service offerings of all kinds is you get to show the live demo, and the interface changed at midnight that night.
Oh yeah. Yes.
Which may happen to you more than a lot of other people.
If you demo enough, yes, it does.
Yes.
I think we were watching somebody's presentation at TechBash last year, and they had videos of everything just because to get around that problem happening.
That was the reason was I'm doing stuff in the Azure portal, and if the Azure portal changed last night, I don't want to have to figure it out on stage.
Right.
So therefore, I made a video of what I'm doing. Interesting tactic to try and get around that. So I think what we kept coming back to is that there was just a lot of value. It seems like there will be a lot of value in hands-on people building pipelines, builds, and then understanding the subtle difference between builds and releases, which I think in the archives, which they might still be on the Philly.net channel, I think I grilled you for a half an hour because I didn't quite, it just wasn't coming through. Difference between a build pipeline and a release pipeline. And now, but it's good.
Yeah, but now we have, and this is something we certainly talk about, there's that merged pipeline, or multi-stage pipeline, sorry, not merged. That essentially gives you that release and build in that one.
In one place, right. Which the interface doesn't lead you to. But I think what you've told me is that if you did this, if your YAML file did both, then would they be graphically represented separately here? Maybe that's another show.
They would not. It would be in your build.
In builds only.
It's just release ends up being the endpoint of that as opposed to some kind of an artifact that you can then pick up.
Okay. Because a user going through this step by step, because it's kind of lending you, I'm just thinking like a user is I've got pipelines, so I want to do a build, then I want to do a release. The interface is leading you towards set up your builds, then figure out what happens to it to deploy it. And in here, if you use this interface, the YAML is here. You can go after it, right? I think we've seen that. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But these little icons and the workflow, I mean, this seems like this is going to take some time.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a different way of building and releasing, because in here, you think about the build and release, you're going to do it and it's going to wind up in one location. That's it. Whereas here, we're actually building a release pipeline. We're saying, hey, I built this code and I want to run it through my environment. So I'm going to have a stage that is the development, and I will have a stage that is my testing, and I have a stage that is production. And I might, if I deploy to in Azure multiple regions, I might have multiple production locations where that has to go, and I can essentially have those be a vertical part of that stage, and we can walk through all of that, as well as the different gates that you can put in place, right? Somebody basically looks at the stuff in staging and says, yes, this is approved to move to the next step. And then somebody at the beginning of that next step, production, says, okay, we're ready to roll this through. So having those gated checks and those approval processes in place, those are all things you can do when you have that pipeline with the multiple stages in it. But if you do that multi-stage of release and build in one, it's going to run and that's it. So, and for some apps that might be fine. For using DevOps, no matter how you want to use it, I think is the important part, but for certain applications, you need that extra bit of comfort of and checks as it goes through those stages.
Yeah, right. So what was really nice is that just by going through the product, I think we were starting to be able to say, and we don't have to go back to the screen, but it was becoming obvious that, hey, there actually is a lot to talk about here.
Yeah. and we didn't even get to some of the things that I know are going to come up as part of the conversation. So there is some kind of an intro 15-minute slide deck around, hey, these are the things we're going to talk about with Azure DevOps, right? So there has to be that in there. There's going to be some discussion around permissions. How do I let people have access to my Azure DevOps? How many people can I let have access to my Azure DevOps? Do I need licenses for everybody? All of those things are questions that are going to come up. How do I make the connections over to, let's say I'm deploying to Azure. How do I make that connection happen? What permissions do I need in Azure or in my Azure AD to make that happen? Or who do I have to work with to make sure that I got those? So those are things that are going to come up that are just kind of part of each of those individual conversations, but they do cross over those as well. So.
Yeah. So it turns out that it'll be a very quick day.
Oh yeah.
and there's a ton of content to work through. So
yeah. But I think it'll be a fun and useful. And the other thing, while this is very tool focused, if you think about what we've structured here in the talk, what will likely come up, and if love to hear the thoughts of the chat room on this, but I think what will come up at some point is, well, what should we do for a branching strategy? How should we do DevOps? How should we work as a team? And that's, the tooling gives you the flexibility to work in any number of different manners to make that happen. But I think that becomes a conversation to have, like over lunch or as part of the breaks, or even if everybody wants to have it as part of a, maybe a little sidebar whiteboarding session where we just kind of go off and talk about it. But that's something that is going to be there regardless of what tool you're going to use, right? Mm-hmm. But it's the flexibilities in there in the tool to do it however you want is what it comes down to. So it's just a matter of what works right for your team, because DevOps in and of itself is a good bit process as well as the tooling.
Right. And the other thing is that, figuring out, so here's an interesting topic, is figuring out what to put in a presentation, even a 7-hour one or 6.5 hour one, when you're dealing with a product that's very big.
Yeah.
Because some of the things we're not discussing here at all, but are part of this, is how Azure DevOps, it's so interchangeable. You can use repos, or you could bring in, you can even see it in the interface. You can bring in GitHub or bring in, I forget what else. I've seen other Bitbucket's in the list too.
Yeah.
And then there is an other, so you can just give it the URL. So it doesn't have to be, somebody's branded service. It can be your own Git server, as long as you somehow get the hook
Make
in.
that accessible, yeah.
And I'm pretty sure that all the major vendors, because you got to figure everybody's most likely using one of the major vendors, probably has the hooks in, or even just has a webhook feature that this just works with.
Yeah, and so there are things out of the box that you can hook to, and then there's a whole marketplace that lets you bring in those other connectors to other things.
Okay. And then what we haven't discussed is that, because I've seen in the labs, what if you decide you want to use Jenkins What if you decide you want to
Octopus.
do Octopus deploy or static analysis as part of your build using a vendor? I think it might be SonarCube in the list, just in the labs.
Yeah.
But so now you're saying, okay, I'm a customer of this other product. I want the product used, so I need that integration to happen too.
Yeah.
And are those, in your opinion, are those just a few slides where you're just giving people the idea that they should research more because you can't, there's just not enough time in the day?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, with all of the various tooling that is out there in this space, I think the comment I heard probably about a year or so ago was, or maybe more, is that, if you can script it, there's a way to get it into Azure DevOps.
Okay.
Right? So however it is that you are doing deployments in your environment, PowerShell scripts, Bash shell scripts, all of those things are things that we could, if that's how you're doing them, or there's some way to translate what you're doing into that, we can get it in if there's not already some kind of connector. And there seems to be, from a lot of the conversations we've had with customers and the things that they're using, a lot of those popular connectors are there. There's also, where was I going with that? There was another, and now I have lost that train of thought.
Just to different connectors or different products? I mean, I know one of the things that impressed me the most the very first time I started doing labs was when I started looking at the labs that integrated third-party products or even just said, hey, you don't even have to use our deployment at all.
Right.
She just said, wow, how does that plug in? It's just so interesting. And no, I didn't have the product, so I didn't go through the lab. But so I guess to bring it back to present. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I remember what that point was. So while we're developers, we think of everything we talked about in Azure DevOps in that lens. What's great about the platform itself and what it can do is there are people in the business who might be building Power Apps.
Oh, okay.
And there are different connectors and different plugins to take your Power Apps from whatever environment they are hosted in, bring that code and have it reside in a repository that you can version, but then also be able to push that out to another environment inside of a Power Apps world. So, or Power, for those who do that seems foreign to us, but for those who do Power Apps, that makes sense. Having an environment, we have different environments, but they have an environment where they build and they can basically push it to another environment that is their production or shared with the rest of the company.
Right.
Similar story when you think about machine learning or ML ops and having the ability to use the same framework and the same set of tools to do your machine learning scripts in your Python scripts or your Jupyter notebooks or what have you, and have those reside in containers that you then publish out to Kubernetes that you're able to use to run your to do your analysis against. So all of those, there's another use case in the business that can still leverage the same set of tools, all because it gives you the ability to script and connect to various sources. So it's a different way of thinking than we're used to on the dev side, but it's the same problem. I'm making something that I need to version, and I need to get it from one environment to another, and DevOps will let you do that.
Right. So in terms of the presentation then, it's you want to make sure people walk out of there understanding that there's so much more. I liked how you said, if you can script it, you can integrate it. But even the few concrete examples makes a ton of sense. So do you put this, do you conclude the sections that might correspond roughly to each of the different parts of the product with here's the more? Because one of the things that I think about, although I'm not always very good at, is try to avoid shoving that all in that last 15 minutes where, okay, I mean, I don't know how many times my presentations have been like this. Slides at the beginning, then away from the slides to work, the real meat. People are excited. This is the real core of the presentation. People are asking questions, whatever. And then the wrap up.
Yeah.
And that it's just not working.
Right.
But you're running through those last couple slides because you're like, oh, and don't forget to check this out and check this out and check this out. So I don't know if that has to really, if I'm trying to say that we should do something about that. If those last few slides have links and places to send you off, then even somebody who's beginning to switch off, if they remember to go get the slide deck, they can go look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that because
avoiding that,
I don't know.
Maybe you don't have to. Maybe it's not.
I don't think. I think because with this subject and this set of tooling, and because everybody's doing something a little bit different, I don't think you can avoid, hey, for more info, go check here.
Yeah. So I want to go back to my Git presentation real quick. And the reason why is because let's just pretend, right? So you're seeing, all right, so now we're doing some stuff. You can imagine that I went off to show people things. And then here it is. Here's okay, folks, here's the stuff at the end that we're not really going to show, but I thought you might be interested in. 3 talks that I think everyone should see. Mm-hmm. I guess really you could have watched these 3 instead of mine. but I do think that these are very good. And then so I just did this. I did the whole, okay, now that you've watched this, if you want more, go watch these things. Now, I'm not trying to cast an aspersion on it or say that that's bad, but what do you think about that kind of wrap up? And is there useful wrap up versus filler wrap up? But this tends to be something I do a lot, and in fact, a lot of times it's, hey, here are the YouTube videos that I really enjoyed, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in preparation for this.
Right.
It could be, here's where I went after this.
Sure. I think there's so much content out there, and if you're searching for a topic like Git, or you're searching for a topic like Azure DevOps, anything you can do to curate that and say,
yeah, thousands of videos will come back.
Exactly.
Right.
If you like what I presented, and you're thinking that I made some kind of connection, and we at least feel that you've had some knowledge out of this, you've gained something out of it, you may also find these useful. I think I think it's awesome.
Yeah, I try to do it. It tends to be, and listen, it's not perfect. If you looked at that slide, I didn't actually grade them by saying this. I basically just redid this talk versus this is a great continuation. So, and I try very hard not to. I try so hard. And maybe I try too hard, that if I see a talk, I try to say, well, I don't want to do that exact same one because people could just watch that.
Right.
But I do recognize that doesn't mean people found it.
Sure.
And it doesn't matter. No 2 things are alike, because even as I discuss this topic that I happen to be passionate about, I have things that I want to really make sure I drill in on, and the other one may not.
Yeah.
So
you're going to put your little spin on the demo or what have you.
But I do like to wrap up presentations with, here's more.
Yeah.
Probably an inspiration for why I've tried to say that here's what we're watching, here's what we're reading, just because I'll say, hey, I watched this video in the last week, month, year. I remember it. It's still sticking in my head. So maybe you'd like it too.
Yeah.
So
I agree. I think that's awesome. And comments from Pruna, it's a nice way to show other good content about that subject. So I think it's spot on.
That's good. So I think ideas about presentations, right? And you've got to, and I'm definitely trying to help out, just to, Rich's name is on the presentation next Friday. But I know it's a topic that I'm interested in too, so I'm definitely trying to help. But trust me, it's all you, Rich, and you'll do great. No, I'll be there.
Yeah, I was gonna say you were gonna.
Yeah, I'll be there.
So gotta, now that we have an outline, we can figure out how we're gonna divide it up, right?
Yeah. So hopefully, I thought we were thinking it might be useful that maybe just by going through the outline, you might see some of the thought process, and I want you to understand that this didn't come from a book. It didn't wasn't pre-planned. And the next time we do a different talk, because it's a different subject that might not have that neat kind of separation, it might be totally different.
Yeah, it might not be hands-on as well. So
that's true. It might not be hands-on.
And I think there's definitely And I don't know, I struggle with this sometimes too. There are definite levels of technical detail you get into, and your audience may not need that level of detail. And that's a whole different way of thinking if that's not what you're used to.
Right.
So definitely be cognizant of your audience as you start to pull those together. I think it's another thing we kind of jumped into it because everybody we're talking to is technical for these code camps, but there's oftentimes we talk to people in the business, we talk to people who don't, have that, don't want to know how it works. They just want to know why they might want to use it.
Okay.
It's a different discussion.
No, that's true. Your presentations, knowing your audience. We talk a lot about tech presentations here, but I mean, I've had to do them at work as well. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's technical, and sometimes it's really not for a technical audience.
Yeah.
Or even, I don't know. At some point in time, we all probably will have to get up and teach something.
Yeah.
Or express an idea. So, I don't know that there's any specific pattern for everyone, and I do think that I'm trying to do more of getting out Notepad or something else, and at least getting thoughts down, even if they're not organized correctly. Because the mistake I used to make was that I used to start at slide 1, and I would try to go in order, and then next thing I knew, I'd put like 2 weeks into it, and I was on slide like 8, because I just couldn't get past the idea that I'm not going. But I knew where I wanted to go, or at least I knew, even if I didn't know how I wanted to get there,
right.
I knew some of the things I wanted to cover.
Yeah.
So what I should have done is just gone ahead and splatted them on a slide, even if it wasn't perfect. Because then now that I've gone ahead and even maybe have the bad slide, it says what I want to do here. Well, I can't present this, so I better put some time into taking that out and drawing the picture or whatever it is I want to do.
Right.
Because the worst thing that happens is, and I think every presenter probably goes through this, is you finish the presentation and you think about what you left out or what you didn't say. But in the end, I recommend that everybody give it a shot. Today we have ability to do this that we've never had before.
Yeah.
You can make a YouTube video, and that can be your first presentation. And you get the right one, and you never know, and you're off and running to hundreds of subscribers just because you researched a topic you were interested in that it just not a whole lot of other people did, and a lot of other people needed that information.
Yeah. And you mentioned something I think is kind of important if you want to get into presenting, is that doing a video and seeing yourself on video makes a whole world of difference in how you think about your presentation and the things you need to work on to make it better. We go through and we deliver a presentation, and at the end of it, it's like, all right, that felt pretty good. Yeah. I didn't and I'm at all, and it was pretty good. Yep. And you go back and you watch it. It's like, okay, wow. Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of presentations I've given are just live, and they're over, and the room, I like to say the air leaves the room.
Yeah.
Which is why I think we started streaming and recording in the first place, because we thought there's valuable knowledge here that just went away. Everybody in this room got it, and that's it. So awesome. So Code Camp next Friday.
Yes, Friday the 18th. We're not doing any video.
Okay.
Because we're going to be in giving a presentation. So there is no live stream on the Friday. We are going to live stream the Saturday, starting at 8 o'clock. Because the first session is 8:30, and we typically do the intro with Bill and the Code Camp stuff. So look for us to kind of go on the air around 8, and then we're doing network tests this week.
Oh.
To try and make sure we don't run into the problems we ran into last time.
Yeah.
We actually had the whiteboard out and how does network connectivity on this segment of a network be impacted by the Wi-Fi thing, which is what we're thinking was the underlying issue.
Oh, that's really cool.
And to try to say, all right, how can this possibly happen? And we're all scratching our heads we don't know. There's no reason it should. So they're bouncing up the chain to make sure. So. Okay,
well, that's really cool. I'm glad that's awesome that even the thought process is taking place, because we definitely want to see it grow, both the live stream and the follow-up videos. So
and that was an unfortunate performance for those who tried to stick with us. And there were a number of people who did. We just want to avoid that this time around.
Yeah. Well, great. Yeah. Well, we'll see. Hopefully everything goes great and we'll have a good Saturday. And I think by next Wednesday, we should know what room and who's in it.
I'm starting to look at that now.
Right. Even though, I mean, the changes can happen at the last minute, but I think on next Wednesday's show, we should be able to say this is the lineup.
Yeah.
So, all right.
That's cool.
Well, I think that was different, and hopefully whether you're watching us now or in the future, that you got some value out of our show tonight.
Yeah. It was a fun discussion. It's not, it's not the typical, crack open studio and walk through code and exam.
I mean, I did want to bring up the product, and I didn't mind talking about it a little bit. That's totally fine, but it was always in the context of, okay, now how are we going to communicate?
Yeah.
It.
Absolutely.
So
great idea. I like it.
That's what you got to do, right? You got to, whatever topic it is, at some point, put it out there and say, now, what am I going to say to people again?
Yes.
Whether it's a C#8 talk, or maybe a talk about a web framework, or even just a way you like to do things at work, or a tool that you like to use. We would love to hear from you. And if you have made video presentations that you would like us to watch, and you're watching us on YouTube right now, then put that in the comments for this. And definitely we'll watch it and make sure other people, will get to see it and know about it. And that could be a great way for you to get started. And I really do recommend that if you want to try this, that there's no harm, no foul, do it. It's something that we need is the community to grow, and I think it's important that it's not the same faces all the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we heading into Code Camp, and pretty soon I'll be taking that talk up to TechBash, as Andy said earlier tonight. So this will be my first attempt at it, and then we'll see if it's wholesale changes for TechBash or not. I don't know. We'll find out.
We got 3 weeks in between, so it's all good.
A little bit of time. So. In any case, we'll be back next Wednesday.
Yes.
The plan is 8:30 U.S. Eastern Time. And so when we get to next Wednesday, the 16th, or if you're watching us later, then go cruise over to that video and watch that one too. Make sure that if you're on YouTube and you like this video and like what we're doing, to like the video, leave us a comment about it. And then if you subscribe to the channel, then that helps you know when new videos are posted or when we're going live on the stream. And it actually probably helps other people find the channel too, because I'm sure that in YouTube's infinite wisdom, it figures that, popular videos must be the ones that I show people. So if you liked what we're sharing and you think other people will too, by doing those 3 things, I think other people will see it. All right. So I think that we're pretty good for the Dev Talk show for this week. And so I will let it go. For Rich Ross, I'm Chris Gomez. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the Dev Talk show.